Legendary creatures are pretty cool. After all, they tend to represent unique individuals from the Magic story, and over the years they've become even more prevalent in the game as Commander has become the most popular format. White legendary creatures tend to be aggressive, or make lots of tokens, or counters, or gain you life, and indeed, some of the best legendary creatures in the game are white. If you're curious about just how good they've been, I've done a top 10 on the subject. However, not all legendary creatures are good, and many of them aren't fit to be played as your commander or in 60-card formats, and those are the exact cards we'll be looking at today. Magic's worst white legendary creatures. This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. Use the links in the description to visit their store. At number 10, it's Zuberi Golden Feather. For 4 generic and a white, you get a 3/3 flyer, and it gives all of your Griffins +1/+1. This one's going to upset the Griffin fans, but I have good news for you if you're one of them. Unlike the other cards on this list, Zuberi does have the potential to not be on the list forever. I mean, the rate is pretty bad to begin with. A 5-mana 3/3 flyer just isn't where you want to be, but if this game had more Griffins in it that aren't mediocre, Zuberi would be good enough to not show up here. As it is though, the number of good Griffins in Magic can be counted on one hand, so having an inefficient Griffin Lord isn't very good. At number 9, it's Rashida Scalebane. For 3 generic and 2 white, it's a 3/4, and you can tap it to destroy target attacking or blocking dragon and gain life equal to its power. Kind of like Zuberi, in a super ideal world, Rashida Scalebane can actually do something. Like, if your opponent has a whole bunch of dragons, Rashida can be pretty scary. Although only killing attacking or blocking dragons is a fairly big restriction on an already narrow card, since your opponent can just avoid doing those things, and you're also talking about a 5-mana 3/4 to begin with, which isn't exactly going to strike fear into anyone. If we lived in a universe where dragons were as common in Magic as humans are, Rashida Scalebane wouldn't be on the list, but unfortunately, that's not the world we live in. She has a very narrow ability, and most of the time she's just a 5-mana 3/4, which is awful. At number 8, it's Opal-Eye Kanda's Yojimbo. For 1 generic and 2 white, it's a 1/4 with Bushido 1, which means that when it gets blocked or blocks, it gets +1/+1 until end of turn, although in this case it's almost always only going to be blocking because Opal-Eye also has Defender. You can tap Opal-Eye to prevent the next source of damage of your choice, and have that damage dealt to Opal-Eye instead. And you can pay 1 generic and a white to prevent the next one damage that would be dealt to Opal-Eye. So the idea here is that you can redirect damage to Opal-Eye and reduce that damage so that Opal-Eye survives. Damage prevention and damage redirection effects are some of the weaker effects that are part of the white slice of the color pie. We've seen literally hundreds of cards that do it over the years, and very few of them have been successful, although there were enough for me to do an MTG top 10 if you're interested. Anyway, there are several reasons damage prevention usually isn't good. One of them is simply that it's highly situational. If damage isn't being dealt, a card that can prevent it is entirely irrelevant. That might sound like a small thing, but if you've ever played with damage prevention cards, you know that things don't actually line up the way you expect them to very often. The other reason it tends to be pretty bad is just that it's not very efficient. For example, in the case of Opal-Eye, paying 2 mana at a time to prevent 1 damage is a huge problem, and preventing just 1 damage is not guaranteed to be meaningful in the least. Add to this the fact that Opal-Eye can't attack, and you have a card that is even less likely to be able to make use of its abilities. All in all, Opal-Eye is inefficient and has super narrow, overcosted abilities that should keep you from ever wanting to use it. At number 7, it's Kiyomaru First to Stand. For 3 generic and 2 white, it's a creature with power and toughness each equal to the number of cards in your hand. It has vigilance if you have 4 or more cards in your hand, and when it deals damage, if you have 7 or more cards in your hand, you gain 7 life. Saviors of Kamigawa has a whole cycle of Maro legends, with their names referencing the original Maro, a card that has power and toughness each equal to the number of cards in your hand, and a card which is itself a reference to Mark Rosewater. Anyway, some of the Maro creatures are pretty okay, but not this one. For this to feel remotely efficient, you better have at least 5 cards in your hand, and that's not exactly something white decks usually have going on, and it requires you to jump through a lot of hoops for what is still a pretty medium creature. It's also kind of annoying it doesn't have straight up lifelink. If you've done the work to have like 15 cards in your hand, it should let you gain 15 life, not 7. But yeah, Kiyomaru just doesn't do what white decks typically want to do, and even when you do manage to pull it off, you don't really feel like you're doing something that impressive. At number 6, it's Italia, Samite Master, another damage prevention white legendary creature. She starts with a horrendous stat line. She's a 5 mana 2/3, but she does have an activated ability. You can tap her and pay X, but you can only spend white mana on X, and then you can choose to gain X life or prevent the next X damage that would be dealt to target creature this turn. So she's capable of casting a scaling version of Healing Salve every turn, and the Salve is a famously mediocre card. Gaining 1 life for every mana or preventing 1 damage with every mana is very inefficient, and this would be pretty bad even if it was that flexible. But they made the ability extra narrow. First, only accepting white mana to pay for the ability is very annoying. Mini decks have colorless mana produced by artifacts after all. Additionally, she can only prevent damage dealt to a single creature each turn. She doesn't stop damage dealt to you ever, or damage dealt to any creature in a turn. You have to make the choice when you activate the ability. If your game plan is to sit back and use this ability every turn, which is kind of what she's asking you to do, you're just going to lose, since your opponent will be adding to their board and ignoring Italia entirely while you continue to spend your resources on something as unimpressive as this activated ability. At number 5, it's Rashka the Slayer. For 3 generic and 2 white, she's a 3/3 with Reach, and when she blocks 1 or more black creatures, she gets +1/+2 until end of turn. The flavor here is actually pretty sweet. She's from Homelands, a set that focuses on the Sengir family, so it makes perfect sense that she is a great blocker against Sengir Vampire. But as good as that flavor is, a 5 mana 3/3 with Reach isn't exactly something you want to be playing, even back in 1995. It's pretty annoying she also doesn't get the buff when she attacks an opponent who controls a black creature or something. It still wouldn't be a good card, but as it stands, she's a purely defensive card that is pretty much only meaningful against black flyers that are the exact right size. And even then, it's not like you feel like you're getting a great deal. At number 4, it's Huang Zhang, Shu General. For 2 generic and 2 white, he's a 2/3, and he can't be blocked by more than 1 creature. His stats are well below rate, so your opponent doesn't really need to block it with more than 1 creature to kill it in combat, so that ability doesn't mean much. You could go with a Voltron strategy, with the idea being that you make him so big that no single creature can take him down, but that's a lot of effort, especially in a game that has tons and tons of way better options for you to slap auras and equipment on, creatures that come with abilities that make it inherently hard to kill them, and Huang Zhang definitely isn't one of those. At number 3, it's Hazdur the Abbot. For 3 generic and 2 white, he's a 2/5, and you can pay X and tap it to redirect X damage that would be dealt to another white creature you control. That's right, he's another white legendary creature that does something with damage, but he's substantially worse even than Italia and Opal-Eye. This is because his ability can't actually prevent damage. The best he can do is redirect it, and he has to redirect it to himself. So, yeah, you could pay 4 every turn to redirect it and keep it alive, but there's no guarantee that preventing that amount of damage will matter, especially because it can only redirect damage that would be dealt to white creatures. And as with Italia and Opal-Eye, if your game plan is to sink mana into this every turn, you're just going to lose the game. And the awful stat line does nothing to make up for that. At number 2, it's Peng Tong Young Phoenix. For 1 generic and 2 white, it's a 1/2, and you can tap it to give a creature +0/+2 until end of turn, but you can only do it during your turn and only before attackers are declared. Even if Peng Tong could tap to give something +0/+2 until end of turn at any time, it would be a bad card, but Peng Tong can't even do that. Back in Portal 3 Kingdoms, they sought to make activated abilities less confusing, so they really restricted when you can use them. Unfortunately for Peng Tong, that's a huge problem. The boost isn't all that likely to make a creature a better attacker to begin with, but the fact that your opponent already knows where the buff is going before combat takes place is a big part of what makes this kind of effect useful, the threat of activation. That threat is entirely eliminated since you'll have already used the ability, and of course 3 mana for a 1/2 is itself quite bad, and that combined with a bad activated ability makes Peng Tong a really bad white legendary creature, but I still think there's one more that's even worse, and that would be the number 1 card on this list, which is General Jarkeld. For 3 generic and a white, it's a 1/2. Definitely not the stat line you want to be starting with, but it does have a super wordy activated ability that it taps for. Surely there's something in there that makes up for the bad stat line, right? In fact, let's read the Oracle text together. Choose 2 target blocked attacking creatures. If each of those creatures could be blocked by all creatures that the other is blocked by, each creature that's blocking exactly one of those attacking creatures stops blocking it and is blocking the other attacking creature. Activate only during the declare blockers step. So yeah, it has an ability kind of similar to Sorrow's Path, a famously bad land that you don't want to be keeping the company of. Now, Jarkeld's not quite as bad as Sorrow's Path. After all, it does something other than have an ability, and it doesn't damage your whole board when you use it, but I think the comparison is apt, because General Jarkeld's ability is also super narrow. It does stone nothing unless 2 attacking creatures are blocked by 2 creatures who could block both of them. That itself isn't that common of an occurrence, but even when it does happen, you have to have blocks set up in such a way that switching them also matters, and oftentimes it just won't. You need creatures that are the right size, and you need your opponent to block with creatures that are the right size too. Basically, this ability is useless 99% of the time, so you're mostly just getting a 4 mana 1/2. The other cards in this list have way more upside than it does, and most of them are more efficient creatures too. That's what makes General Jarkeld the worst white legendary creature in Magic. So, those are my picks for the worst legendary white creatures in the game. If you want to try and build a commander deck around one of these awful legends, because maybe you're hoping to prove me wrong, check out the description, where you can find a direct Card Kingdom link for each card in the video. Did you like this video? Would you like more top 10s about the worst legendary creatures? If so, don't forget to like and share the video. If you'd like to see future videos, don't forget to subscribe, and if you want to catch up on past videos, including many more that look at the worst cards in Magic, you should see a playlist on your screen shortly. Thanks for watching.